This is Plymouth, a city with a long maritime tradition and home to warships of the Royal Navy for many centuries. It was from here that Drake sailed to meet the Spanish Armada in 1588, and in 1982 ships of the task force which recaptured the Falkland Islands began their long journey here. But in July 1815, these waters witnessed a truly remarkable event as thousands of people in small boats rowed out into Plymouth Sound to catch a glimpse of a passenger on board a Royal Navy warship, HMS Bellerophon, which was moored out in the Sound. The object of their curiosity was none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, one-time Emperor of France and England's most feared and hated adversary in the 19th century. This is the story of the Bellerophon and Napoleon Bonaparte, and of a unique cultural event which took place on board this ship when it played host to the most feared man in Europe. Britain had been at war with Napoleonic France for nearly a quarter of a century, and throughout much of this time the threat of invasion was a real and constant fear. Ships of the Royal Navy, England's wooden walls, patrolled unceasingly, while forts were built all along the coast to repel the French should they ever succeed in crossing the Channel. Only when Admiral Horatio Nelson decisively beat the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 did the threat of invasion finally recede. Even so, it was to be another 10 years of grueling fighting before the war was to end at the battlefield of Waterloo in 1815. Just a month later, on the 15th of July, Napoleon, now deposed and fearing a show trial and execution at the hands of the restored Bourbon monarchy, sought the protection of the British as he boarded the 74-gun ship-of-the-line HMS Bellerophon, stationed off the port of La Rochelle. As one of the young officers on board, George Home, recalled later in his diary,
all was expectation and excitement. The first lieutenant was engaged in seeing all the belaying pins got an extra polish, and that every rope was coiled down with more than usual care.
For the ship, it was a propitious conclusion to what had been an auspicious career. Launched in 1786, the Bellerophon had played her part in the key naval battles of the war, including, of course, Trafalgar. Now, as she came to the end of her fighting life, the Billy Ruffian, as she was affectionately known to her sailors, was to perform one of the most significant tasks of all, conveying the self-proclaimed Emperor of France to captivity. As soon as the Emperor was on board, the Bellerophon got underway. She crossed the Bay of Biscay, sailed up the English Channel, and anchored in the sheltered waters of Torbay on the 24th of July. Although we might imagine that the deposed emperor would be treated with disdain whilst on board, even with crowing contempt perhaps, in fact, the crew of the Bellerophon received Napoleon magnanimously. Evidence of the relaxed atmosphere on board during the passage to Britain is the fact that on the 18th of July, the ship's officers took it upon themselves to perform a play for the Emperor as the ship crossed the Bay of Biscay. One of the young midshipmen on board, Francis Wall Justice, carefully preserved a playbill from this time inside his personal log. On it he wrote, "Performed before Bonaparte on board the Bellerophon." The first of the two plays listed on the playbill, The Poor Gentleman by George Coleman the Younger, had opened at Covent Garden on the 11th of February 1801. In it, the rakish Sir Charles Cropland, aided by a comic cavalryman named Olopod, tries to force his affections upon Emily, the virtuous daughter of the poor gentleman of the title, Lieutenant Worthington. The lieutenant, invalided out of active service at Gibraltar along with his servant Foss, often reminisces about his time in the armed forces. Cropland's machinations are foiled by the heroic Frederick Bramble, whose uncle, Sir Robert, engineers a happy ending by solving Worthington's financial woes and consenting to the marriage of Frederick and Emily. But it was not such a simple matter to stage a play on board a warship. As Midshipman Home later reported in his journal,
"The stage was fitted up between decks, more, I am afraid, in ship shape than theatrical style."
Theatre in the early 19th century is the main cultural form of activity, and that's not just in terms of professional theatres. Obviously people did go to the theatre on a regular basis, but it's also that theatre was performed informally in amateur surroundings, family gatherings. People would also have read theatrical texts to each other, but also on their own. So theatre very much is part and parcel of the cultural life of the time. One of the problems of performing theatre on board ship, of course, is the practicalities of performance. What do you do about a backdrop, about props, about costumes? And I think that they would have improvised. Obviously on board ship there's a lot of canvas, which is relatively straightforward to paint. They would have borrowed costumes, they would have made costumes, they would have done with props, they may have used banners in order to indicate location rather than having scenery. And I think some of the humour and some of the fun from onboard theatricals would have related to the mismatch between the stated costume or props and what the sailors actually had to hand.
We have come to Britannia Royal Naval College. For over 100 years, this imposing structure, which stands above the harbour town of Dartmouth in southwest England, has been the Royal Navy's premier training establishment for young men and women seeking a career in the Navy. Nowadays, young officers complete a period of several months at Dartmouth before they commence their sea training. To commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Bellerophon plays, officers under training at Dartmouth are today recreating elements of the plays once again.
One of the huge advantages of acting out the plays performed for Napoleon on board the Bellerophon is that it gives us an insight into the cultural history of 1815. Very often, and particularly in a British context, 1815, Napoleon's 100 days, are reduced to the Battle of Waterloo itself. By concentrating on the on-board theatricals for the Emperor, it gives us a different insight into relationships between Britain and France. Here, Napoleon is not little Boney, the tyrant, the enemy. Instead, he's someone to be treated with respect as a monarch, someone to be entertained. And it just reminds us, I think, that the period is not just about warfare, but that through the theatrical interchange between Britain and France, we can actually see a broader cultural context in which battle is taking place.
Although the training in today's Navy is very different to that experienced by the young officers on board the Bellerophon, the constraints are very familiar. Let's see what our modern midshipmen make of the material they have been given.
He's easy. We had warm night that day, Your Honour.
We did indeed, Middy, we did.
There was Crillon's batteries and 4,000 men behind us at sea.
Moreno with his fleet was before us at the sea.
At 10 in the morning, the Spanish admiral began with his cannonade.
And the battery from our beloved king's ships.
Red-hot shot poured from the king's garrison.
Cannons roar.
Mortars and howitzers.
The enemy's shipping in flames.
Fire again.
They burn.
They blow up.
They sink.
Victory! Old England forever, Your Honour. Huzzah!
Huzzah! Aye, midshipmen. Against the world in arms, old England forever.
Huzzah!
Huzzah!
We have no limbs to help our country now. We shall never fight for old England again, Your Honour.
No, Middy. 'Tis impossible.
But our hearts are for our country still, though Your Honour has only half pay and I'm but an out-pensioner of Chelsea.
We have no right to complain, Middy. National bounty beyond its limits would be national waste. And it is impossible to provide sumptuous living for all.
That's true, Your Honour. Every hero that loses his life in the field must not expect a marble monument.
'Tis of little import, Middy. A gallant sailor's memory will flourish, though humble turf will be busier around his grave. The tears of his... Sir Rob, is Lucrezia? You're in it already as Fred?
Here we come to the climactic scene of The Poor Gentleman, where the two rivals meet to fight a duel over the honour of Captain Worthington's daughter Emily. At the last moment, all is resolved. Sir Robert Bramble has paid off Worthington's debts, and the path is now clear for Emily and Sir Robert's young nephew Frederick
Miss Worthington,
to be
I
married.
confess my fault and plead for your pardon. You will not only, I hope, afford me your own, but intercede with Mr. Worthington for his also. You checked me, rather roughly indeed, in a career which I have acknowledged to be wrong. Sir, instead, therefore, of proceeding in resentment, it will be better to offer you my thanks if you will be pleased to accept. Sir, 'tis more spirits than thought, but I believe he'll hunt the pleasanter for it in Leicestershire.
Miss Lucrezia McTabb, I confess my fault and plead for pardon, since I, unluckily, left you in a puddle, and sincerely hope you'll never be in such a piddle once again.
Stand away, you brute!
Sir Robert, I hope you won't withdraw your friendship, and it would give me a mortification to be cut off from your custom.
Oh, Master Olipod, your little foibles are like your small quantities of milk.
I owe you one. I'll stay, and he'll ask me to dinner.
And what are you saying there to Miss Worthington, Frederick? Frederick, put your jacket on, Frederick.
What, where are we?
And what are you saying there to Miss Worthington, Frederick?
Telling her what good cheer it is in Blackberry Hall, Uncle, and what a worthy gentleman at the head of the table, where I'm going to have the pleasure to lead her.
You are devilish ready to do the honours, isn't he, Mr. Worthington?
To do honour to the human heart, sir, I found him very ready.
And have you found him so very ready to do the honour to the heart, Miss Worthington?
Yes, indeed I have, sir.
Yes, but I have so little time left now in this world that some of my arguments are a little shorter than they used to be. When I was hobbling over the stile after Frederick, there, and thought the dog might be shivved to atoms, I made a determination in my own mind, if he happened to survive, that he and your daughter, what's the name, young lady?
Emily, sir.
Ha! A pretty name enough. That he and Emily should make a happy couple.
Never, sir, never.
So I drew upon my bankers, instead of John Doe and Richard Doe, and you may reimburse me at your leisure. Fred, put your jacket on.
I thought I skipped ahead.
No, sir. Insert soliloquy.
Many more, is it?
Do you see that sheep over there? I bought her 3 weeks ago.
Crack in.
I shall never be able to repay you this debt, sir, but by long and miserable installments.
You shall give me security.
I wish it, and in my power.
Miss Emily, pray come here. Frederick, you dog, come on the other side of me. Frederick, put your jacket on.
No!
For goodness sake! No, he hasn't got any lines. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Take your jacket off again.
I'll stay out of this one.
Let me appoint you two trustees for a bond Mr. Worthington shall give me. A bond of family alliance. Fulfill your charge punctually, and heaven prosper you in your obligations. Mr. Worthington, what say you?
You overwhelm me. I cannot speak.
Embrace her. There's Lucrezia. Embrace. It's not going to
Frederick, embrace the woman.
Embrace the woman, Fred. Come here.
Oh.
So how does it feel to be participating in this recreation? We asked one of our players for his thoughts.
It's nice to think in a way that the Navy still does that 200 years on, and the fact the young officers are still putting on plays in a different situation, a different time, but it feels less like a homage to what they were doing than just a continuation of it, really. And at the end of the day, the Navy is a way of life, it's not just work, so when we were asked to have a bit of fun, we said yes. It's part of the lifestyle otherwise we'd be sitting around in our rooms being bored. So it's a chance to have some fun, and I think back what they did 200 years ago. I'm a bit of a historian myself, so I quite enjoyed that actually.
The staging of the poor gentleman before the defeated Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte stands as a unique cultural moment in the history of Britain and France. This commemoration of the production marks the 200th anniversary of the event and is a fitting tribute to the men serving on board that remarkable warship. As one of the ship's officers, Lieutenant Henry Smith, wrote at the time, "For my own part, the whole business seems like a dream. No ship in the British Navy has so much to boast of as this ship."